welcome to A Slice of Mental Health. So this is Series 1, Episode 2, and I'm here, I'm Tracy, I'm the mom.
And I'm Cara, the daughter.
And we're here to talk about what is mental health. So just a reminder that we're taking an experience look. So this is our views on what we think and what our experience is of mental health.
Mm-hmm.
So mental health in general, how we describe it is your kind of everyday ups and downs, just that bit about being human. Mental illness is something that we both experience, and it stops you doing what you want to do in the world. So it's actually persistent, and it makes you feel ill. And just be clear that we're not talking about disorders, which are we would say are a long-term condition. So things like schizophrenia, bipolar, personality disorders. So that's not what we're not talking about. So we're going to talk about what it's been for us to develop our understanding around our own mental health, what it looks like when we've been ill, how did we find out that we had illness, because I certainly didn't know that I had an illness, and then how we've navigated that, so what's worked, what didn't work, and then maybe some things that we think might be useful for others, which certainly, so not advice as such, but just things we found made a difference for us. So I'm going to hand over to Cara.
So I think it's like, just to reiterate what Mum said, we're always, in these podcasts, always coming from our own context and from a position of hindsight. Mm-hmm. Mum and I both struggle with mental illness, and it's important to note that everyone has a mental health. Everyone. The same way everyone has physical health, sorry. It's just sometimes based on what's happening in your environment or a trigger, it sometimes just doesn't always work the best, and that's when you end up ill. So we have both. So I have a mental health, but I've had mental illness, and it was long term, so kind of it was a part of who I was for about 11 years of my life, so from young childhood to teenage years. And I feel if I'd had more education as a child and I'd had more support from my peer group and my teachers, that I may not have ended up with mental illness if there had been some understanding that I had been a child that was getting bullied, and that was the bullying that was causing me to become ill, and it wasn't that I was broken and that I wasn't developing properly. And being a teenager with mental illness, it did feel like, will I ever be well? And that's what mental illness is. It's a long-term feeling of, will this ever be any different? Is this how I'm always going to be? Am I always going to go to sleep anxious, wake up anxious, and be terrified of what's to come? Am I ever going to feel comfortable with my future? Illness is almost, for me, it was constant questioning, and that was because I never had any other context other than being mentally ill. So for me, being mentally ill, it was like being on autopilot all the time, and I was just surviving, and I was just, Mum and I always ponder, like, I went to school, like how did I function with these feelings of not wanting to be here, of feeling like everyone hated me, feeling that I was never going to be good enough, that I wasn't ever going to amount to anything. And for me, those types of questions is what resulted in me having attempts on my life and ending up self-harming, and eventually ending up needing medication and therapy. So yeah, it was like driving on autopilot. I was in autopilot and I was in like flight mode all the time, and I was scared. And what's different now is that I have moments of, this is what the difference is between mental illness and mental health, is I have moments of anxiety and fear and questioning, like, what am I going to do, and when I be here, or having really moments of really low mood. But it's not persistent, and that's how, for me, it differs. That's the difference between the mental illness and what your mental health is.
Yeah. And I think this language, so I think it's really important what we're talking about. And there is a phrase that, there's no health without mental health, which was a phrase that we used in public health. And I used to get sometimes quite angry with people who, would talk about mental health in a way that was just about the illness. And it was like, if you didn't have an illness, then you didn't have mental health. And maybe we will use different language in the future, but this is the language we've got at the moment. And as you're saying, Cara, for you didn't know what was going on a lot of the time with these feelings. You didn't know what was you knew what was causing them, but sometimes it was difficult to know which was the bullying, which was developmental, which was hormonal, which was your sensitivity, sensitivity being a good thing, not a bad thing, but being, sensitive to emotions. And one of the things that I think was really interesting about you as a child that I've just thought about is that you could read a room. What was really interesting about you as a young child is you were trying to work out your own emotions, what they meant, what was the response to the bullying, but also you could read the room. You would sense what people were thinking, what was going on. You'd be so attuned. You would be very attuned to if somebody wasn't feeling well as well.
So sixth sense, we used to say.
Yeah. So that we're now saying sensitivity or empathy was there from a very young child. So you felt feelings. You felt your own feelings very strongly, but you also felt others, and you then responded to negative feelings towards you or approaches in a way that was very strong. It was a very strong response to those feelings.
I think about that now, and I think that was a way of protecting myself. I think that was I would now use the language of psychoanalysis, like I'm reading people and trying to base what their thoughts are on me and what their feelings are, to either be able to be a comforting person if they need it, or to stay away from them if I need it. But I think back to when I was a child and teenager, because I was so unwell and because I would use the word vulnerable, because I was still a child, and I was still underdeveloped, and by that I mean not fully developed yet emotionally. It was a way of keeping myself safe. It was a way of going, okay, I feel safe with you, so I'm going to lean towards you, but you give me mean girl vibes, and you're actually going to hurt me, and I don't need to be hurt. And this is me putting the language to it now because I can, but as a teenager I didn't know that. It was just this intuitive way of setting boundaries with people. Yeah,
and it is that thing, isn't it? So that's, back to this, what is mental health, what is mental illness? It's that, you're always navigating your mental health the same way as you navigate your physical illness. And again, I don't know who's listening to this, but just to say that, something I found really helpful was that I was thinking, sometimes you wake up and you just feel great, amazing, you feel physically really healthy, strong, it might be nothing you've done, you just slept well and you feel great. And then other days you'll wake up and you just feel, oh gosh, I feel really tired, I feel really grotty. Nothing wrong with your mental health, you just feel really tired. And that's the same with with your mental health. Some days you just feel, I just feel really sorted, content, today's a good day. And other days you just feel really out of sorts and and it may be that something's going on. There may be something that's making you think that way. But I suppose what I've learned is to think more about mental health being something that I have all the time and something that I'm conscious of, and if it's in a good place, it's in a good place, and if it's not, actually to pay attention to it. And maybe I can tell a little bit of my story about paying attention to it, because you talked about not knowing you had it, or not knowing what was going on. So my story is that I would say I had a really happy childhood, but at 14 was when I started to feel high levels of anxiety and worry. And it is a tricky time, so we're going to talk about that. 14, that age group is a tricky time anyway, and it's difficult to compare with others, but I do know that I was hyper anxious, over things, and I was worrying about the day that might never come. That was how it played out. I wasn't living in the moment. I was just worried, and it was a fear of failure all the time. I mean, it's an exam time, so it's a fear of failure. So that was probably when I felt that sometimes I felt like it was too much like hard work. I use this language of hard work because it's something that triggered my illness. When I start feeling life is just all hard work, then I'm usually becoming unwell.
When there's no joy.
No
or
joy.
Or you don't find joy in the things you used to.
Yeah.
And I think it's that it's having a mental health is, like you say, it's recognising when it feels good and when it feels bad, and being able to name that the way, say, if you've got a sore knee, some days it feels absolutely fine, and some days it feels flared up, and it's being able to go, oh, well, why does it feel flared up? Well, it feels flared up because I actually ran on a treadmill yesterday and I've used it a lot. So what I'm going to do today is put a compression bandage on it and look after it.
Yes.
And we need to be able to apply that to your head as well, because when you don't apply that, that's when you end up needing to stay in bed for a week because you've using the same analogy, because you buggered your knee to the point that ligaments are torn. And I feel like I use the analogy of like comparing mental health to physical health. I don't know if I necessarily agree with the fact that they're similar. I think mental health is ever present, and it's very resilient, but it's also quite fragile. I think if you have physical health difficulties, you're going to have mental health difficulties alongside it. And I know that's a little bit, it's not quite what we're talking about today, but it's also just, it's something that I think if you're never taught how to look after your mental health and you ignore it, that's when you become ill. And it's so much to do with this education element. It's so much to do with being able to go, okay, why am I feeling like I don't want to get out of bed and I don't want to go, well, for you, Mum, it's rowing, or like for me, it's like go to the gym. Why do I feel like I don't want to have good interactions with people around me? Oh, well, it's because actually I've been triggered by something that reminded me of a bad time in my life, and I have to recognise that.
Yeah.
Whereas for me as a teenager, because I didn't have any of that understanding of being able to recognise my feelings and my mind and my thoughts and like feelings. When I say feelings, I mean like physical feelings, like my heart rate going up and feeling tense and feeling like that's what I mean by that, or even feeling lethargic and fatigued. I didn't know that they meant that my mental health wasn't well, so therefore I didn't put anything into play to start feeling mentally well. I just continued and pushed through.
Yes.
And that's where it becomes illness, when you push through and you keep on pushing and pushing and pushing and you don't do anything to correct it. And that's why education is so important. It's being able to go, actually, I'm not coping and I need to start looking after that. And whether that's via therapy, medication, or setting boundaries with people that make you feel unwell.
Yeah.
But yeah, that for me is kind of the difference.
I think so. What I thought I was just that way. So there's this.
But no one had ever told you.
No, so I just assumed that, because I'd kind of learnt that worrying. So the thing about worrying is everyone says worrying is a waste of time, because it is a waste of time. But I had learned that if you worry, bad things don't happen, which is a really weird way of looking at it. So generally, as a child, it meant that the worry hadn't resulted in bad things happening. But I was a worrier, so I would have said I was a worrier. I also thought that to live in this world, you had to do everything at
100%.
100%.
110.
100. Yeah. So I had a gold bar standard in everything I did.
It's exhausting.
People probably still laughing because people probably still do. But so it's fine to have high standards. I'm not saying that any of these things are wrong, but it's when you're doing it, and we've talked about this in other episodes, but about when you're doing it from a frame of reference of not being good enough. So I just did everything at 110%, whether it was my work, my exercise, my being a friend, all the things you do. I'm not going to list all the things you do. We all know what we have to do in the world.
There's no room for flaws.
There's no room for flaws.
Your version of flaws.
Yeah, and then when you become a parent, so back to this perfect parenting, or how we think we should be as a parent, and you add that in, so you're doing that at 110%. There was nothing being let down. There was nothing that I was letting go of. I was doing everything at 110%. But I just thought that was the way I was, and actually it kind of worked. I had a nice home. I had a good job. I had lovely children. I thought that I thought that was just the way it was. But I was absolutely exhausted from it, and I wasn't sleeping. I was worrying at night. I was overthinking. I love that word now. We didn't have it then, but I was just overthinking. We didn't have it then. So there's like language, isn't it? Yeah. But overthinking. And nothing would have changed, I don't think, if I hadn't had my breakdown. Well, no, nothing would have changed if I hadn't had my breakdown. Nothing would have changed because it kind of worked.
It's interesting, just hearing you say the story again. It's interesting that it was also the physical elements that led to the ultimate, the lack of sleep.
Yes.
The constant worrying, which is draining.
Yeah.
Overthinking, reflecting, analysing, which in extreme volumes is anxiety.
Yeah,
it's
exhausting. Because
this for me, epiphany. I don't know if it, but your kidneys have your adrenal glands, and anxiety. It's your body that informs your mind. So if your body is in flight mode, it's producing adrenaline, which is gonna make your mind work. It's the thing you need to get up and go, but it's going to make your mind go, and you're not going to sleep. So when the physical parts come into play, you're ultimately going to, I wish there was a better word, but break.
Yeah.
You're gonna feel broken because you're everything else is just not. It's not. You're not. Your homeostasis just isn't there. Your inner peace just isn't there because everything's in hyperdrive.
Yeah. And when I broke, what it looked like was continuous crying, which meant actually I couldn't go to work. So something got taken out because I actually couldn't go to work because I was continuously crying. I'm laughing about it, but it's interesting how crying is one of my responses, a learned response, but also a response to difficulty. And because I couldn't stop crying, I had to stay home and not go to work. And I actually, my mental illness doesn't usually take me into my bed, but it took me into my bed, and I couldn't look after you and your sister, and your dad had to do everything. And that was when I went, oh no, this is not right. I'm going to have to do something now because I couldn't look after you. And that was, that was big. And I didn't know what was wrong, really. I mean, we'll talk about it but another time, but I was being bullied as well. So there's some patterns here. But I was being bullied as well, so I put it down to that. So again, you could absolutely argue that my response was to the bullying, but it wasn't just the bullying. Or was that
the tipping point?
It was the tipping point, yeah. It was the breaking point, the tipping point. And I realised that although, I kind of accepted that who I was in the world to that point, I didn't want to be that person anymore.
You feel uncomfortable in your body. You feel,
And that's where, that's where I knew that what I was experiencing wasn't normal. And it was interesting because I kept trying to go back to work. And every time I tried to go back to work, I'd phone up my manager on the Friday and say, so I'm feeling a lot better this week, so I'm going to be back on Monday. And I'm sure how many times I did that, but at least 3 times.
But this is such an interesting point, and this is where physical and mental illness come into play. If you do not allow yourself to be ill, it is going to take so much longer to get better. Like, I think for me, it was around when I was 17, that's when I had my epiphany. I went, fuck, I'm ill. Excuse my language. Like, I had that sudden moment of like, I'd for years had been, mum and dad had taken me to CAMS, I said I started medication, and this is a whole conversation of like the treatment side of mental illness, but this is what I did. Mum did CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy with me, and we learned all this kind of stuff, but it wasn't until I had one amazing therapist. She was private, which we'll talk about that as well, the sort of elitism within mental health care, but I had access to this private therapist, and she taught me the correlation between your body and your mind. And I don't know why it resonated. Maybe it's my inner nerd, but like I just got it. And it was this sudden education of, too right, when you're in school, you feel like you can't breathe, and you feel panicky and you feel scared, and too right, because you're under constant attack. You feel like you're under constant attack, even if the attack isn't there. And it took to 17 to go, I'm unwell, and then I gave myself permission to be unwell, and that's what started my recovery. You have to, I felt for me, and I've said this to friends before, is you have to embrace and practice self-empathy and go, you're not okay. And it's okay not to be okay, but you also have to do something. You can do something about it. You don't have to just sit and not be okay.
Yeah.
You can accept it. You like that little phrase, that tagline, it's okay not to be okay. Yeah, but also go get help. It's okay not to be okay, but that doesn't mean be complacent with your mental health. It also means go and seek help.
Yeah.
And that was it for me. It was that moment, and that's what I think is, like, for any parents that are listening or teenagers that are listening, it's noticing that you can, I know mum and dad did this, you can give your child access to everything when they're unwell, but it does take a little bit of allowing that your child to have time to go, I now want to go get help. That was the key for me starting my recovery. It was going, I don't want to keep on hurting myself anymore. I don't want to be trying different medications. I can feel myself getting upset. Just name that feeling. It's upset, because I didn't want to be that child anymore. But mum and dad, I'd had access to therapies since I was 12. But it took to 17 to go, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to get better. And there's a little bit of a waiting game. If you're ill yourself, you won't know it, but you might have that epiphany. And if you're a parent with an ill child, it's a waiting game. It's waiting, maybe just being there and being supportive, and that's what helped. That's how we navigated it. But mum was there, and dad was there, and gran and grandpa, and like my sister as well. It was just waiting and supporting, and just keeping them, keeping me looked after, until I went, okay, no, I want to go get help now. Do you remember that? Do you remember it was kind of a...
So I just want to check in, you're okay, so continue.
Yeah, I think it's, I think this is the thing, when you talk about your feelings, like, especially when they're so hard-hitting as talking about your trauma, like, it's not going to be an easy conversation, we'll just share some of the vulnerability mum and I have to go through to do this. There's no ego involved. Well, maybe there's a little bit of ego, but like we want people to hear our story and understand that it does get better, and there's purpose to us, kind of, mum's used the expression airing our dirty laundry. But yeah, so I think by talking about it, I'm gonna, you're gonna get upset, and I think my response would be is natural to what is really actually quite an upsetting thing. I sometimes feel disconnected from that version of me and this version of me now.
Yeah.
But we're rejoining them for purpose.
We were talking about this a bit earlier about the fact that we're doing this from a position of hindsight, but both of us will feel different emotions at different times. They just come up. But part of this is that what we're hoping to do is we're trying to navigate this, but we're also hoping that it might help you navigate it if you're trying to have a conversation either with your mum or your daughter, to know that it's okay for you to have these feelings and even share them a bit. When your child says something that's, just to, we don't want to model being perfect. We want to model being human and how we're coping. And as something I wanted to bring up as well, because it's something really important you said, Cara, about being ready for that change. And again, I've been talking to some mums just over the weekend who've got girls who are around 16, and just recognising that age and stage is different for everybody. So if you have got that grumpy, sulking teenager who doesn't want to talk about anything, then that's a difficult time, and they might not be ready to go on their own journey. So there's something really important about your child feeling ready to get better or to engage. That doesn't mean you're not trying all along the way, but that was something that I hadn't appreciated, that you would. And I remember very clearly saying, such a clear part of your story, but saying to you, what's different about this time? What is different? And you said, I want to get better. And that is huge. So it's just really say there is ages and stages, of your child's development and adolescence. And it's different for everybody, but that was the difference for you. You took control, and it was a huge relief, because as a parent you're trying to take control in the sense of find the right support, help you to get to a better place, but it feels like it's all down to you.
And what I think both you and Dad were very good at was you never put blame on me. And this, I think, the reason why I was able to eventually, there was some secrecy sort of at the start around my self-harming, and there was that, and that relates back to our previous podcast with stigma. There was some of that stigma of thinking no one's going to understand, I'm just going to be dismissed. But you and Dad had it took him a little bit more time to sort of remove that stigma and not just call me a lazy teenager. I've got his permission to say that. Like, he's okay with me sort of saying that, but what you never did is, as I was trying to get better, you never went, oh, for bloody sake, why are you not just getting better? Like, just get over it. Like, oh, that girl's saying that, it doesn't really matter. Like, just get over it, which I've heard my friends' parents say, like, I've heard that being said. It's not uncommon, and I think that's not to put blame on parents, but I think that probably comes from an element of frustration, being like, I have exhausted everything I can as a parent, and you're still not well. Why are you not well? What am I doing wrong? Why am I? And this is your voice, but like, why am I not parenting well enough?
But can I just be totally honest again, because I think it's really important? I felt those things inside. Yeah. So I'm pleased that we were able to contain it, because I can, we've talked about this, but I didn't feel I was containing it all the time, or we were containing it. Yeah. But I suppose, so what I'm saying, I want other people to hear is that you will be feeling those things inside. Why my child? Why does everyone else seem to be, getting this right, and why are their children doing this and that? But trying to hold it, or that's a bit about talking to others, isn't it? And finding, we talked about what helps, and we're going to move on to a little bit about, what helps. So one of the things that did help me was talking to others. I didn't always have peers that were sharing their difficulties in an honest way, but I did have people that I trusted with my story. And that helped. That helped to talk to people that may not be experiencing difficulties, but did not judge me because I was experiencing them, and I felt able to talk. So talking's a really important bit. What sort of things helped you?
I think I know I know what wouldn't have helped, and it would have been dismissive language. I think knowing myself now, that would have done a lot of harm. I think if you'd made me feel invalidated and in the state I was in, very vulnerable, I would have just shut off and not have spoken to you at all. What I do know is I battled a lot with the labels I was given from the medical model, which is to give a diagnosis so that you can create a treatment and therefore cure whatever the illness is. And that's the model that we do have at the moment in Britain, whereas Mum and I talk more, we interchange, because there's a space for the interchange between the holistic model, which is the naming your feelings, validating being human, and then there's the medical model, which is looking at it as an illness, and we kind of recognise there's space for both. And for me, it was really trying to disconnect myself from my feelings and the labels I was given. So like depressed, anxious, suicidal, self-harmer. Like I wasn't a self-harmer, I was someone that struggled with self-harm. Or it takes more words, but I just had to, and it's empathetic language. It's disconnecting yourself from the thing that you struggle with and looking at it as like it's not 100% of who I am, and it's not what I will always be. And that I started to, that understanding I started to develop when I started my therapy with this therapist at 17. It's kind of that you don't have to be that anxious teenager. You can be a teenager that has an anxious response, and that's okay, and you're allowed to. Anyone else would. Very validating. And that was it. It was a normal response for someone that was struggling. I wouldn't expect anyone else to have gone through what I went through and not feel emotionally dysregulated. Like it just isn't how the psychology works. It isn't how the human brain works. We're still. I keep on going back to this primitive thing, and that's the thing I'm fixed on at the moment because I love it. But it's still you still have that old brain. We've not fully evolved to the point that if we get attacked externally, that we don't run and hide. We still do that. And then also what helps is growing up. And that is, again, I wish I had someone say that to me when I was a teenager, someone in their 20s go, you know, it is, I'm really sorry to say, but it's also a time thing. You will feel different when you're in your 20s. This isn't always going to be who you are. This struggle will become your power. And that's for me with this. It's taught I ooze passion about mental health. I love it. But that comes because I had the mental illness that I really struggled with, and I've spent a lot of time embracing it, understanding it, reflecting on it, to be able to go, actually, this is a really powerful thing that I've got. My empathetic skills that I got from being really sensitive are really, I've got beautiful relationships with people because of that. And then it's also like another bit of, I feel like I'm giving a list of advice, but it kind of is. And it's not advice because it's what worked for me, for us, for our family. And it's not going to work for everyone. But in all of this, it's also get help. This is what you will always hear within mental health services. And it's the message that's spread across the UK. But utilise your mental health services. If you need to go on medication to feel like you can start talking therapies, and that's what you need to do. And it's not being ashamed to cut people off that make you feel invalidated, and to glue yourself to people that make you feel comforted and understood. And if you've not got that, then there's therapists who you can create that with.
And listening to you, it reminds me, Cara, that as much as I wish, I wish you hadn't been through what you've been through. No parent wants that for their child. They really don't. However, what I am noticing is that at 24, you know more than I knew at 44. In fact, you know more than I know now. A lot of the time. But so there's a bit about what you experienced in childhood if you can get the right help and support, doesn't shape you for the rest of your life in a negative way. It shapes your life, but it's not all negative. And that's what I thought, is that because of what you'd been through, your future was bleak. And your future, your present, who you are in the world now, is amazing, and it's from all the learning and things that you've been through, and you're using it exactly that, claiming it as your power. So I suppose the thing I want to say for somebody, for my kind of generation maybe, is that don't assume you can't change. Because I assumed the way I was the way I was going to stay. Didn't like it very much. So if you don't like the way you operate in the world, and it gets in the way of being who you want to be, then be kind to yourself and do something about it. Try and find a way to navigate that. Don't punish yourself for how you are currently coping, because whatever you use to cope is your coping, and nobody can tell you what is right or wrong. But if you don't like your coping mechanisms and you want to change, you can. It's hard, but you can. And I suppose it's about that bit about taking control. Finding out, going on that journey and finding out what helps you. I think the biggest step, and I'll say this time and time again, is knowing that you don't want to be the way you are now. Recognising there is a problem. Is the first step, and that's scary, especially if you've been operating that way for a long time and you don't really know what different looks like. And just to say, I haven't had a complete personality change. I still very much who I am in the world, but I'm not ill. I'm well. And the other thing that's really helped me is to do things that scare me. And people sometimes say, oh my goodness, you're just always doing something or doing the next adventure, is that because you're not happy being you? It's absolutely the opposite. I do these things because there's nothing more scary than being in your head. I feel like my anxiety used to get in the way of doing things when I was younger, and it's like, there's no time like now.
Well, you've got one life.
Yeah, if you want to try something that scares you, it's still not as scary as having depression. And something that we both do is journaling, don't we?
Yeah. It's such a cliche. I think we do it for different reasons.
Probably.
So it's such a cliche thing to suggest if you're struggling, but writing your thoughts down, and it doesn't it doesn't have to be a productive way of doing it. It can just be word vomit. And the reason I do it now is, and I think because I've grappled with that, not thinking I'd live past 16, and making a decision I wasn't going to live past 16, which is a whole other conversation and very heavy. But so everything I kind of do, I do thinking that one day I'll be 80, because I now have such a lust for life, and everything's such a win, and I embrace and love everything that I do, and I try things with the full want that one day I'll look back and go, oh, despite being a mentally ill teenager, regardless of being a mentally ill teenager, I did all these things and I loved them. So that's why I do my journaling, is I write things down for hindsight. And I still sometimes, because I would still say I'm in recovery. I wouldn't say, I don't think, my opinion on this, I don't think if you struggle with your mental health as a teenager, you're ever going to feel fully away from that version of yourself. It's kind of you'll have moments where you go, is this always going to be my baseline medical language, but is this always going to be who I am?
Yeah.
But I look back at my journaling when I have moments, it depends on what the context is, but sometimes when I have moments of going, am I always just going to struggle? Or am I always going to take things so deeply? I look back at my journal and go, nah. Your mindset is very different. So that's why I journal. That's a lot of words to explain right in your face.
And I journal sometimes just to check in with myself. So I just write down what I'm thinking about stuff, whether it's about my job or it's about what's going on with Cara or what's going on with somebody else in my family.
Because she's so obsessed with my life.
Oh, I'm so obsessed with you. I just write stuff down, and sometimes even things like I write down how many times I've done exercise, because I can get a bit obsessive about my sports and exercise, and I kind of check in. It's like, are you doing that because you wanted to do that much this week, Tracy, or are you doing it because you're obsessing about, you know, your health and fitness? So yeah, I just write it down, and it helps me think outside my head, and also it probably helps me, whereas I always had to phone a friend, I always prefer to talk about it. It helps me go, do you know what, you don't have to talk about everything that's going through your head. You can kind of sometimes just work some of this stuff out yourself, and not burden your friends, or not burden.
Oh no, because I think that's exact when you do journaling, or if you're like me, you talk to your dog. It's because you don't have that element of going, I've just given someone else my stuff. And you know, we're empathetic people, so like I'll talk to my partner, I'll tell him all my feelings and upsets, and then I go away and go, have I just made him now worry and upset and scared about me, like for me? So when you journal, your paper's not going to feel anything, you know, it's emotionally removed, and you can offload without then having, if you ever experience it, like having that guilt of thinking, I've just given someone else my shit.
Yeah.
Not because you're burden, like it's not a burden, but like it just takes away that guilt that I've certainly had before, and I know you've had.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of describing it.
So it's just remembering, little closing idea, it's just remembering that everyone has a mental health. Not everyone has mental illness, and it's a journey that involves acceptance and recognition and validation, and I said this in the last podcast, but empathy towards yourself, self-empathy. It's forgiving yourself for not being okay and doing something about it if you feel you can.
Yeah, and you're always working at it.
Yeah.
You're always working at it, which doesn't mean it's always hard work. Sometimes it can be hard work. It just means that you're more conscious of it.
And it's not a permanent state either. It's something that you can...
Yeah, but it's just paying attention. It's just paying attention to it. And if you're feeling a feeling, just being a bit curious about it, and sometimes just let it pass, let it fly by. And other times going, okay, I've been feeling this for a while now. Do I need to kind of work it out through or do something different? And I think that's what we're saying is just look for your ways of coping and dealing with it, and own your power, because it's a kind of a superpower as well to be able to get in touch with how you operate in the world. And if you can begin to understand it a bit more, then it's a lot easier to feel more content, I think, more settled. More content and settled. Inner peace. So, Cara, what's next?
Next week, we're talking about generational trauma.
We're going to talk about generational trauma and patterns, and learn patterns, both the good and the bad. But we're going to talk about, I suppose we want to talk about how the potential to change things again, to maybe break patterns,
break cycles.
And again, we'll be talking about it from our experienced look.
Yeah. Please turn on the notification bell on Spotify. We are also on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, where you can find us under @Slice of Mental Health, varying different spellings, but it's essentially Slice of Mental Health. You'll find us.
Look for the logo.
The very painstakingly created branding, and we hope you enjoyed this podcast, and we'll be with you next week.
Goodbye for now.
This has been the Slice of Mental Health.